All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I am in Palm Springs. Um, and what I'm going to be talking about today is memoir structure. But I can also talk about other elements of the memoir, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. I'm just going to take you through a brief slideshow first and give you some examples of structure in memoir. And then once I'm done with that, then I'll open it to questions and answers. I'm going to try to share my screen here. And for some reason, it's not finding it, but you would think after a year of Zoom, I would be better at this. Let me try one more time. Here we go. So let me know, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Writing memorable memoirs. I don't know why it's in that weird font, but I liked it, so I kept it. So here's what to expect in this presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to tell you why structure matters in memoir. I'll give you some sample structures, and then there's going to be a pop quiz. Don't worry, you're not being graded on this. It won't go into your permanent record. And then I'll give you one more very personal example, and then I will share my contact info, and then we can do Q&A. I'm a person who I've written for the New York Times, I've written for the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post. Most of my career has been in newspapers, but then I published a memoir called Braver Than You Think, and it was released by Counterpoint Press in May 2020. As you can imagine, May 2020 was not an ideal time to have a travel memoir come out in the world because it was, when the pandemic was very new, a lot of people weren't reading and people certainly weren't traveling. So that was a challenge. And my background is that I went to journalism school at Ohio University. I have a master's degree in creative writing from the University of California, Riverside. But what my bio won't tell you is how much I love reading memoirs. And what I do is I feel like I see books in a different way than most readers do. Like I really love to see the nuts and bolts and kind of figure out how it works. And so sometimes I'm not entering a book just for pleasure. I'm there like picking it apart. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm sure all of you have diagrammed sentences before, like in grade school or junior high, when you learned the parts of speech. So that's kind of how I want you to think about, but on a bigger scale. So the structure of a book is kind of like diagramming a sentence. You can pull a book apart and figure out like how it works and why it works. But there are all these little elements to it. And that's how I'm envisioning it, just on a bigger structural scale. And structure is important because it helps you write the book. It gives you a direction for where you're going. I have to tell you, I tried writing my book for a period of 9 years, so many different ways. And I approached it with many different structures, which I will talk about later. But it wasn't until I figured out what I wanted the structure to be that it really fell into place. And it seems like it should be so easy, right? Because this is your life. You already know the story. You know how it ends. You know all the characters. But you really have to figure out how you're going to tell it. And I think of it kind of like a vase. Like you can have the most beautiful flowers in the world. You can have, and those would be like your characters and the plot. You can have these beautiful flowers, but if you don't have a way to present it, then they're just lying there flat. You want that beautiful vase to hold it up. So structure also offers you momentum through the story. It helps pull the readers along, and it gives them like signposts along the way. It tells them where you're going, and once they know where you're going, then they're with you. They will go along for the ride. So I say it's like pulling them onto a moving train. Like if the reader has if the reader trusts you, then they will let you pull them onto that train and take them places. It's just a matter of like telling them where you're going. So I'm giving you lots of metaphors here because sometimes like the vase metaphor works for one person. Sometimes the architect metaphor works for other people. But basically, like you can't build a house without that structural integrity. And so, you know, all the elements of memoir are important. Like you do need a strong voice. You do need rich, complex characters. You do need plot. Just like any type of creative writing, you know, the elements of fiction apply to memoir as well. So you need all of those things, but really if the foundation isn't there, then you don't have a good book. And so here are a few examples of different types of structure. And these aren't hard and fast rules. You might find a memoir that kind of straddles the line between two different types, but this just offers you a way to think about how some books are pulled together. And again, you know, as soon as these rules are established, then someone breaks them, which is the great thing about creative writing, you know, that there are no rules, but this kind of helps you see how books are put together. So a braided storyline, it weaves together parallel narratives. And those are often in different timelines. An example of that is the best-selling memoir, The Fact of a Body. A lot of essays do this too. I just read a beautiful essay yesterday where a woman talked about her grandfathers who worked in coal mines. And she talked about like the coal miners and their histories, but then she also talked about her personal story. And so it was alternating passages where she would talk a little bit about the coal miners, and then she would talk about her personal story, and she wove them together really beautifully. A frame it puts a frame around a specific period of time. So that is told mostly in a traditional chronological manner, with some backstory woven into it. So I'm sure you're familiar with Eat, Pray, Love. There are also a lot of like memoirs where people do something for a year and write about it. Like A.J. Jacobs is famous for that. He has a book where he read the encyclopedia for a year. And he also has a book called The Year of Living Biblically, where he followed all the rules of the Bible for 1 year. And it was really funny. You know, he grew a huge beard. He had all of these food rules to follow. And he talks about how that affected his life. But that is just like one snapshot of time. Like it's within that frame. So linear takes you from one place to another, typically in a chronological order. So that's used in a lot of coming of age stories. Like Wild is another example of that. And that was like very literally a linear story because she's moving along a trail from one place to another. Into the Wild is another linear storyline. Associative, it pulls together moments associated with one topic. So like addiction or religion, Educated, that best-selling memoir, that would be another example of this. Devotion by Dani Shapiro, which is about her experiences with different religions. Like that spans her lifetime. It involves her childhood. It involves, you know, her life right now. So it's just all of those things associated with one topic. And keep in mind that done well, you probably won't even notice the structure of a book unless you're looking for it. So it's there to support the story from the background. It's there to enhance it. It's not necessarily a gimmick, but it's the spine that holds your story up. So here's the pop quiz. So all the books that I'm talking about here are all best-selling memoirs. And I'll tell you the structure of it, and you can tell me the title. You can tell me in the chat if you would like. And now, if this were a class that I were teaching, and I have taught a class on this before, I would have you read all of these books first. Since we don't have that kind of time, I'm just going to, I decided to focus on best-selling books, hoping that a lot of you have read these. So let's see, in 2012, this New York Times best-selling memoir is written like a trail that pulls readers along the journey with little on and off ramps along the way. These figurative ramps give the readers backstory about the narrator's life. Who can tell me about that? You can put your guess in the chat, or you can raise a hand. All right. I was hoping that, yes, Wild by Cheryl Strayed. That's why I included the word trail there. So it's really beautiful when you look at her story, because she is on a literal trail, but she's also like taking you along this journey with her from one starting point to a finish point. And then when she adds in backstory about her life, it's just like a little diversion from the trail, and then she gets back on it. She takes you along this journey. So it's woven in really organically, and it doesn't feel like she is stopping the story at all to say like, now let me tell you about my childhood or anything like that. It's just like these mini diversions. Here we go. Okay, 2017. This critically acclaimed memoir is written like a braid with two storylines that alternate chapters. One storyline is about a crime. The next storyline is about a childhood of abuse. And at the end, these storylines intersect. All right, this one's a hard one because it was a bestseller, but I don't know that many people have read it. The Fact of a Body by Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. And the interesting thing about this book, I spent some time with Alex and asked them about how they wrote this book. And they echoed the fact that like they didn't know where this story was going until they figured out the structure. And what this structure is based on is, I don't know if you've ever read The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson, but Erik Larson writes a lot of nonfiction books that read like novels. He wrote The Splendid and the Vile, In the Garden of Beasts, or In the Garden of Good and Evil. Wait, was it In the Garden of Good and Evil? In the Garden of Beasts. Anyway, Erik Larson, he writes a lot of these really rich nonfiction books that, I mean, they feel so propulsive, and it's real history, but it has all the elements of fiction. And The Devil in the White City is about the World's Fair in Chicago, and it's about a serial killer who lived in Chicago at the same time. And the story is told in alternating chapters. So you have one chapter about the World's Fair, and then you have one chapter about the serial killer. And the whole time you're like, oh my gosh, this serial killer is going to go to the World's Fair. Like, you know, it's coming, but you have to keep reading to get through it. And that's how The Fact of a Body is. It has that same structure. It's told with one chapter about the crime, and one chapter is a personal memoir, and you know it's going to come together, and you just have to get to the ending to see how it does. So this memoir won the National Book Critics Circle Award and is told in 5 profiles of men who were important to the author. All the men died, and their stories are given to the reader in reverse chronological order. This is a hard one, so I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you. It's called Men We Reaped by Jessamine Ward. And it's a little more complicated than that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the structure, because I think this is such a beautiful example of how structure can really help illuminate your story. So it's told in 11 chapters. 5 of those chapters are profiles of men who all died in tragic ways, and they were all men who were important to the author. So there's a locomotive accident, there's a suicide, a murder, and then the last one is a drunk driving accident. The last one is Jessamyn's younger brother. And those stories are told in reverse chronological order. So the story of her brother dying was actually the first one that happened, but in the book, it's the last one. Now, in the other alternating chapters, she tells the story of her family growing up in rural Mississippi and the life she shared with her younger brother. So if we didn't have this background, if she didn't build it up that way, moving forward in time, but also backward in time, then those storylines wouldn't intersect where they do. If we heard the story of her younger brother dying first, then it would lessen the impact that we have when he dies at the end of the book. And I'm not spoiling anything, you know, going into it, that this is what happens to her younger brother. So I think it's a really genius way to build that momentum, because you know the story is going there and you want to see how it ends. 2006, this massive bestseller is told in 108 sections to mimic the number of beads on a string of Japamala prayer beads. And those 108 sections are divided into 3 parts. Any guesses? Yes, Eat, Pray, Love. And so that's a good example of how, like, most people don't even remember that's what the structure is. And there's an introduction to the book where she literally says how this book works. This book is arranged into 108 sections, and each part is each of those sections is divided into 3 parts. And but it kind of fades into the background because the story is so strong. It's just there to support it. It's just there to hold it up. But she tells the reader right from the start, this is where you're going, and we're there with her. So what structure is your story? And this is where, like, you can ask yourself these questions to try to figure out how you want to tell your story. So the timeline is important. Are you moving forward in time or backward? How long of a period of time are you covering? Is it something over the course of your life, or are you talking about one specific incident or one period of time? You know, maybe it's just something from 1 year of college, or just, you know, a specific trip. Setting, where are you going? Where did you come from? Like, maybe every chapter is a different place. And storyline, how many storylines do you have? Is it just one, or are you braiding in multiple threads together? Are you telling someone else's narrative and blending it with yours? And I think this is a really important distinction to make, because often we think memoir is a true story, and so there's only one way to present it, like just in chronological order. But life doesn't happen in chronological order. So, and what I mean by that is, if you think about all the times you talk about the good old days, or, you know, relive these old memories, or all the time you spend daydreaming about the future, that's what you can let the narrator of your memoir do, because that will organically weave in these moments from your past or offer visions of what's to come. And so, so you don't have to present your story like it's a diary, like it's something, you know, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. What you can do is present it like life happens, which is, you know, there are these little diversions along the way. There are thoughts about, like, this moment that happened in childhood. And it makes it really easy to weave that into your story when you think about, like, how the mind actually works. And so one great place to start, and this isn't always true, but a lot of memoirs start with a moment that's called the dark night of the soul. So this is your major turning point. This is your reckoning. So like in Eat, Pray, Love, it's Elizabeth Gilbert when she's on the bathroom floor and crying, and she knows her marriage is ending, and she literally prays to God and asks for help. It's the beginning of Wild when Cheryl Strayed, she's taking a break, and one of her hiking boots falls off a cliff, and she's like, this wasn't the start of her trip. It was the middle of the Pacific Crest Trail, and one of her boots just falls over the edge. Like that's your moment of reckoning. And so she starts there. That's where the book begins. And then the next chapter basically starts from the beginning and is like, well, here's how that started. Here's how I got to that place. So many memoirs start with that reckoning, usually in a prologue or sometimes an introduction or a short chapter, and then they move into the real structure of the book and just reveal how the narrator got to that place. And here's some techniques you might want to try if you want to figure out how to tell your own story. You can write a fake table of contents. Like if someone were to get your book, what would the table of contents say? How are they going to see your book being told? A similar thing to that is bullet points. If you only had 10 moments, 10 scenes, like 10 moments from your story to tell it, what would those scenes be? Make a list of those and see like how that tells your story. And index cards. This is actually what I used when I was putting together my my finished draft of my manuscript for my editor. And I was approaching deadline. I was in a scary cabin that belonged to someone else. I call it the murder cabin. And so I was staying in this cabin in the middle of the woods off the coast of Seattle, all alone. And luckily, the guy who owned this cabin was a screenwriter. And one entire wall of the cabin was made out of corkboard. And he had a stack of blank index cards. And so I wrote every scene of my book on an index card. And then I put those up on the wall. And I decided that in order to stay in my book, each scene had to have physical movement, like I had to be going from one place to another. And it also had to have emotional relevance to the story. And I can explain why in a little bit, but I wanted my story to have like two major narratives. And so if the scene didn't have those two things, then it came out of the book. And I ended up taking out about 50,000 words out of my manuscript. But that left a lot of holes that I could easily see on the wall, that like things I needed to write into. The final manuscript was 93,000 words. And just having it on the wall in that very visual way helped me determine what I wanted the structure to be. So yeah, so here's my book. And a little bit about it, because I don't presume you've all read it, although I do recommend it. It's about the year that I spent backpacking around the world to complete my mom's bucket list while she was dying of Alzheimer's. So my mom was at home in Ohio, dying, well, not at home, she was in a memory care facility in my hometown in Ohio, and she was dying of Alzheimer's. And I decided to sell all of my things and go on a trip around the world to take the trip that she couldn't take herself. And I visited 17 countries, and I had a lot of adventures in those countries. Like there were just like a lot of exciting things that happened and a lot of interesting things, you know, as I'm learning about every country and doing these things that my mom wanted to do. But I also wanted to tell the story of my mom and to tell the story of Alzheimer's and what it's like to be a caregiver for someone dying of dementia. And so there was so much story to tell. And I didn't want it to ever feel bogged down. Because it's the story of travel, I wanted it to have a quick pace, like the same feeling of traveling around the world. So I knew I wanted it to keep up this momentum, but I also had to build in that backstory. So here's what I did. This is a traditional storytelling structure, the Freytag's pyramid. And, there's exposition where you explain like what the story is, and there's rising action, and then there's falling action. It reaches the climax, and then there's falling action, and there's the denouement. And that works. That's a great story structure, but it didn't work for the story that I was trying to tell, because I felt like my story had a lot of like little climaxes along the way. There was like I was volunteering at a monkey sanctuary in Bolivia, and I was attacked by a monkey and bitten. And I went whitewater rafting down the Nile, and I hiked into the volcanoes of Rwanda, and I met these endangered gorillas, and all of these things happening along the way. I was also in the Arab Spring. I was in Egypt when that was happening, and so there's not one there wasn't like this one climax that I was working toward. There were many, and what I did is I invented what I call the narrative stegosaurus. And in part, this came about because I have a 6-year-old son who has a lot of dinosaurs around. And I thought, oh, that's, instead of a traditional pyramid, my story is a stegosaurus. There are all these little mini climaxes along the way. So every chapter has this like little hump, like along the stegosaurus's back, that's working toward the main climax, which is my mom's death, and then coming back down and finishing the story like right along the tip of the stegosaurus's nose. So that's just to say, like, maybe nobody has ever seen your book structure before. Maybe your story dictates, some other way to tell the story. And here is how you can find me. I'm happy to answer questions. And I'm going to stop screen sharing right now. Okay, so yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I also have some other, I read a lot of memoirs. And so there are some other things like, there are graphic novel memoirs. So this book, Persepolis, is about a woman who was raised in Iran during the revolution. And her book is done like a comic book, and I think like this structure just really helps, like there's a structure within there, but I think using this method just really boosts her story, and it shows like some of the very stark things that were happening to her. Or like this book is called My Life with Bob. It's written by an editor from the New York Times. And she, for decades of her life, has kept a book that she calls Bob, and it's the Book of Books. And so Bob stands for the Book of Books. And in that journal, she writes about what books she's reading. And then as she was looking over it, decades later, she realized that the books she was reading told the story of her life. So it's a memoir that's also about her reading life. It's a memoir in books.
I have a question.
Yes.
There's been a lot of talk about whether or not you can actually have a fictional memoir.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that is because you run into problems with family members about, how much are you going to tell, or if it's a scandal or something bad or something. What's your feeling on saying that it is a fictional memoir? Can you have such a thing?
I think the important thing is transparency. So like at the beginning of my book, I say that like the names of some characters have been changed and some identifying details. There were some people who I felt weren't, they didn't want to have their story told necessarily. And so I wanted to respect their privacy, and I changed some names and those details. But it says right in the beginning of the book, you know, the things that I've done, or in some moments, like I compressed time. So, so like there was an incident that happened on a bus, and I didn't want to put an extra scene in the book where I'm on a bus. So I've made that moment part of another bus trip, just to like edit it for the reader and make it a better story. So I'm completely transparent about that. I don't think that follows journalistic standards. Like if I were writing that for a newspaper, I would never do something like that. But I'm very transparent with the reader and have a disclaimer at the beginning that says, you know, I'm doing this. So I think people should go into memoir expecting that it is an edited and creatively told version of someone's life. It is only looking at life through, you know, the writer's lens. It's not necessarily looking at it as a piece of journalism. I don't think there should be a label like fictional memoir. I have read some, you know, like autofiction, which is fiction that's based on memoir, or fiction that's based on personal story. You know, I mean, there are many different ways to put it. I think just the key is being really transparent with the reader so they know what they're getting.
I wrote a story about my mom's life, and my sister, there was, I won't go into it all here. Most everybody knows a lot about it, but a lot of scandal that went on with my mother's life in very, very small town in West Virginia. And my sister married her high school sweetheart and stayed there. And she was extremely concerned when I said I was going to write this book, because she didn't want all of this to come back up again. She spent the last 50 years trying to live it down. And so I moved them to a different state, and I gave them different names, and I said what you said, is that I've changed the names to protect the innocent and the guilty. And I even went one step further and said, I understand that there's more than one side of every truth, and this is my truth. And if you don't agree with me, write your own truth.
Right.
Because it was my perception. I'm considerably younger than both my brother and sister, and they saw life growing up with my parents in a totally different light than I did, for a
Mm-hmm.
number of reasons. And so, and I've argued with people that this is still a memoir, and people say, no, you fictionalized it, you changed names, you added characters that didn't exist in real life, you did all these things, it cannot be a memoir. And I'm going, yes, it is, because the basis of the story, the key events of the story, are very, very true to my mother's life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the discussion has come in.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of reasons why people do that. You know, in some cases there are legal reasons. You know, the legal team at my publishing house, they didn't have any concerns with my book, but you know, there aren't any real scandals or anything like that. There are no you know, court cases or anything involved with that. There was one thing that I was a little hesitant about because in my book, my mom reveals that she had a child before she had you know, myself and my siblings. And that child was a result of a sexual assault that happened when she was much younger. Um, and I was a little nervous about putting it out there, but I don't have any details about the person. I don't have, you know, I don't even have a timeline in there. So, when I really thought it through, I felt comfortable about keeping it there. Um, you know, I think there are so many different ways to tell a story. And what was really important to me was that I didn't punch down on any characters. I wasn't writing out of any grievance or for revenge, you know. in fact, writing this book gave me some compassion and empathy I didn't previously have for some of the people in my life. Once I really started thinking about it and thinking about what motivated their actions. So really writing through that helped me develop more empathy for them. And I was very cognizant of where my story ends and theirs begins. So I never wanted to assume what motivated someone. I never wanted to write about what drove them to do something. Like I wrote about what happened with our interactions, and that's where it stopped. I never wanted to try to tell their stories. Yeah, one thing, and this gets a little bit with what we were talking about earlier, Dwight, with like some of the stickiness with relationships and how people are portrayed in memoir. Like I said, there was a legal team involved that read my book. I was surprised that the publishing houses don't have fact checkers read memoirs. And as a journalist, it was really important to me to have that integrity and to keep that trust with the reader. I didn't want, there to be some mistake in the book that that would break that trust. So I hired my own fact checker to do that work, which can be really expensive. Luckily, I have a friend who he was one of the top editors at the LA Times, and he, offered to do it for me at a greatly reduced rate, just for being my friend. But it can be really involved. Like, and I really wanted to approach the memoir as a journalist. I did reach out to some people that I wrote about, and I said, "Are you comfortable being in my book?" I didn't let them read it in advance because I didn't want that to compromise the story. But I told them, like, you're in, a paragraph, or you are in a whole chapter or whatever. I'm using your name. Are you okay with that? I describe you, and and I found what people were comfortable with. I also did some interviews with people from my life just to make sure things were accurate, or that my memory was correct. So I did bring those, reporting elements to it, even though there were, like I said, some moments where I compressed time, I changed details. I see there's a question in the chat. Reminds me of A Million Little Pieces controversy. Well, but he just made that up. So that was actually just fiction. It was a great book, but that was a work of fiction. Like he said he was arrested or did time for these incidents, and he never actually did. What do you think about adding photos in the memoir? I like photos in memoirs, but it is very expensive. So that was never a conversation that I had with my publishing house. And I feel like we live in a really multimedia world where people can easily connect with the authors that, whose books they read. So I have put photos on my Instagram or on my Facebook authors page so that people can see photos if they'd like. I've, created a playlist of music to accompany the book. I've brought recipes to book clubs, things like that. I feel like there are all sorts of other ways to engage with the text that don't necessarily take place between the two book covers. Yes, Anne.
Hi, Maggie. I published a memoir in May also, 2020. And the question about pictures, I wanted to answer. I knew that a lot of my cousins would be wanting to see this, and I had pictures of cousins when they were little kids. And I'm in my 80s now, so and they're all, the ones that are alive or, around that, some younger. So I put a picture of the person, of my father in the chapter about my father, of my grandparents in the chapter about them. And then in the back, and so forth. But in the back, I had sort of a collage of pictures of all these relatives, and the cousins were just crazy about that. They loved just seeing those memories and loved reading about my take on my childhood up until I was 9 years old, when I lived around them. So yeah, I think pictures can enhance depending on who your audience is. And of course, I had many other people who had no idea who these people were, but I just wanted to put it in. And so I did. It's my book, you know?
Yeah. I recently read this book, Between Two Kingdoms. It's a memoir by Suleika Jaoud. And as soon as I finished reading it, I started Googling the names of people in it because I wanted to see what they looked like. And I had already kind of conjured up these images in my mind, and I just wanted to confirm it. I think it can really enhance the story. I don't think it's a necessity. It depends on what you're writing. Oh yeah, the things that someone mentioned, the things they carried in the chat. That is a fantastic book. And that is a great example. That is, genre straddling. It's definitely a true story. And he tells it using the elements of fiction. And in some cases, I think he says he does say some things were fictionalized. There's another book, and this one is presented as a novel, but one of my favorite books is called, why did it just escape me? Oh my gosh, I just completely lost my mind. I'm going to look up this book for you. It's Ruth Ozeki and A Tale for the Time Being. And most of the story is fiction, but the writer appears as a character in the book. And those parts are memoir. And so it's very genre straddling, and it is presented as fiction, but it's kind of what they call meta fiction because the author is in the book, and sometimes she addresses the reader directly, which is really interesting. There's a question. Our club teaches high schoolers how to write 3,500 word memoirs of an older person. Any advice about what we should make sure to teach them? I think there are, I think the advice about any good writing applies here. I try to tell people to make it feel cinematic. And by that, I mean like really setting a scene. If you can tell me like one story that is emblematic of a person's life, that tells me more than, telling me all the things that are on their resume. If you can tell me, so here's a story about my dad, and this will tell you basically so much you need to know about my dad. When my mom was always a person who she would wake up early to do her hair and her makeup before bringing me to school. Like she always had this Revlon poppy silk red lipstick. She would do her eyebrows, she would tease up her hair, and she would take me to school. She never left the house without looking perfect. So when she went to live in the memory care facility and was suffering from dementia, she couldn't wear makeup anymore. And her hair, like they didn't do her hair, and she looked very haggard. And my dad knew how much she would hate that. Now he's a guy who spent his life in the Air Force. He doesn't know anything about hair. He took classes on how to cut and style women's hair so that he could do my mom's hair for her every week.
Wow.
So that's a story that tells you so much about my dad without me telling you things about him. So if people can find scenes, like moments and actions that illuminate who the person is without telling the reader straightforward, I think that tells you a real story about the person. It's not just, it doesn't matter where he went to school. It doesn't matter, what year he entered the Air Force. That story tells you who my dad is.
You don't mention it, but one of the best memoirs that I have ever read is Hal Holbrook's memoir, They Call Me Hal. And if you, for anybody who doesn't typically like to read memoirs, I recommend you start with that one, because it just, and I'm not a big memoir reader, although I wrote one, but I don't read a lot of them. But I could not put down I think it's called A Boy Named Hal, if I'm not mistaken. It's Hal Holbrook's. He actually intended to write two of them, so it only is kind of half of his life, and I don't think he's ever written the second one. But it is, if you haven't read it, I really, really recommend you do. It is outstanding. You just can't put it down.
You know, I haven't read that one. I don't read a lot of celebrity memoirs, but I'll add that to my list. And people have also recommended Matthew McConaughey's, which I haven't read yet either.
Hal Holbrook doesn't play up the fact that he's a star. In fact, he downplays it. And I think maybe that's part of why I really like it. It's not beating my chest and look how wonderful I am. Look what I've done. He really bears his soul about the problems that he had as an actor, and how he came to it, and how he struggled in life and stuff. It's just really, really down to earth. You just feel like, he lived next door. It is exemplary. It really, really is good. You need to read it.
Yeah, I will add that to my list. Thank you for the suggestion. I just thought of one thing that I forgot to mention that I promised I would mention. So I said that I wrote my book with many different structures before I found what worked for it. And so I told you that I spent a period of like 9 years working on this book. And when I first wrote it, it was a cookbook. If you can believe it or not. And it was a story that was told in like traveling around the world and the things that I ate. And that is a great story to tell. But I knew like that story didn't have my mom in it at all. I knew it wasn't the story it should be. And so then I changed it and I wrote it as more of an adventure story, as, almost like this adrenaline fueled kind of like backpacker around the world. And that story again didn't involve my mom as much as it should have. And it was really important to me that I bring out her part of the story, because that's what motivated me to travel. That's the whole reason that I did it. And that's the heartbeat that I mentioned. Like I wanted to have that as, just the thing that was constantly, pushing me to keep moving. And without it, the story felt very dead. And so it was only when I figured out that narrative stegosaurus that I could figure out like where I was going. And that really gave me a roadmap to follow. And it was almost like if you've ever done Mad Libs, where it tells you like there's a space where you insert a noun or a verb. Once I had that roadmap, I was like, oh, I need to put this here and I need to put this here. And it, once you figure out that structure, it's almost like it makes it so much easier. It's almost like cheating. I was like, oh, okay, I know where I'm going now. Like it would have been better if I could have told myself this 9 years ago, but I had to write what my book wasn't before I could figure out what it was. So thank you all for so many great questions. Anne, do you have another question or were you waving goodbye?
And you're muted.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to find the darn button. I'm on my cell phone, so it takes a minute to figure it out. I just wanted to say it was a really, for me writing my memoir, it was a hugely emotional journey. Did you get that? Did you feel that? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's people would say to me, oh, I bet this was really cathartic. And I thought, no, it's not cathartic to spend, 5 hours a day in the worst moments of my life. No.
Right. Right.
Cathartic isn't the word that I would use, but it was very emotional. And, going back and trying to figure out who I was at different moments in time and writing about that and exposing it made me feel very vulnerable. But it also, I think it was an opportunity to show myself some grace. You know, I haven't always made great decisions. I haven't always been the best daughter. And this was my opportunity to look back and think like, oh, this is why I did what I did. And I've grown as a person. And so, you know, the memoir isn't just your chance to right the wrong or talk about who you are now. It's really like, you know, showing, just being real about that growth. And I think if you are writing a memoir where the narrator doesn't change in some way, then that's not a very compelling story. Like, we want to know how you've grown and changed, and how, you know, these moments that have shaped your life.
Yeah. I'm going to continue on with my story because that only went till I was 18. So I've got a couple more. I think I have 2 more books in there. At my age, I've done a lot of things, and some of them I can actually talk about. So, okay. Yeah, I really, just because it's the second time I've heard you, I got just as much out of it as if it were my first time. So really thank you for everything you've shared.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all for being here. This is such a treat. You know, with my book coming out during the pandemic, my book tour was canceled. So this is my chance to connect with readers and real people and other writers. Like, that's such a joy for me. So thank you so much. You've just completely made my Saturday morning.
Maggie, I have a question.
Yes.
I see that you talk to book clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer at a writers organization, I'd like to know how does that work out for you marketing wise? Could you talk about that a little bit? Your experience talking to book clubs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've been thinking about writing an article about this because I think it could be helpful for other writers. So I realized early on in the pandemic that I would do these events for bookstores where I met with people over Zoom, but it didn't necessarily sell any books for me. People would tune in to listen, or I would have conversations with other writers, but that didn't translate to book sales. And so, so I thought there has to be a better way to reach readers. I started doing a lot of podcasts, and those weren't helpful in the moment, but I think those have a long life. You know, people continue to discover me through podcasts that I've done. So that's beneficial. But then I pivoted my my focus to doing book clubs, and I decided to make it really easy for people. And I set up a calendar on a service that's called Calendly, and people can schedule book club appointments with me. And I started marketing that. I did some sponsored posts on Facebook and Twitter. I made it my pinned tweet on Twitter. I put it out in my newsletter, and I encouraged people to share the word that I will meet with book clubs. And when people schedule an appointment with me on Calendly, it automatically generates the Zoom link. So it emails everyone in the book club. It puts it on my calendar. It puts it in their like Google Calendar. And then it's just like this, like I meet with book clubs, and in the marketing materials that I've done, I've told people I'm comfortable talking about the writing process. I'm comfortable answering questions about the book, talking about Alzheimer's. Like, here are the things that I can talk to you about. And so I've had book clubs that have, like, one book club was a vegan book club, and they only wanted to know about vegan things that I ate around the world, which I was happy to talk about. I've had book clubs I had a book club of women travelers in Australia, and they wanted to know about, like, how do I pack for a year-long trip? And, you know, some of my safety tips for traveling solo. I have met now with, I think almost 75 book clubs over the past year, which has been really extraordinary. And And that is something that does translate to book sales. And it's that connection that I wanted, like where I get to talk to people about my book, and like, you know, they get to ask questions and we get to have real conversations. So it's been really great.
As a
Yeah.
follow-up to that, Maggie, another person in our club and I are very much involved in our state newsletter,
Mhm.
California Writers Club state newsletter that goes out to, well, now we have about 1,800 members, and this goes out to every one of them. Now, I can't offer you a stipend for an article like that, but if you did write an article and even sold it to somebody else, and we, you know, you could offer us a reprint. I would like to put some article like that in our state newsletter.
Yeah. Okay. I can be in touch with you about that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
How often does that newsletter go out?
We goes 3 times a year, and our next one comes up mid-August. So our deadline is the end of July.
Okay.
Yeah. And did you say the name of that thing that you joined is Challenge Me?
It's Calendly, like a calendar.
Oh,
Calendly.
Calendly.
Yeah. So, and people use that service for all different types of things, whether people want to book a workshop with you or a one-on-one, I don't know, therapy session, or they use it for all sorts of things. I set it up to meet with me for a book club. And the cool thing is that I can set my calendar on there. So in July, I'm going on vacation. So I just completely marked out the month of July so nobody can book anything during July. So it's whenever you say that you're available. It's not just people can book appointments with you willy-nilly.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's been really great. I've met with people all over the world. And I will say one final thing about that, and then I'll let you all go because you've been so generous with your time this morning. So I met with a book club that was in Chicago, and I had no expectations going into it. They didn't send me any notes in advance for anything that they wanted me to talk about. So I just expected to chat about the book. And once I was on the Zoom, I realized one of my mom's best friends was on the Zoom as well. And she had moved to Chicago to live with her daughter. And it's a woman I haven't been in touch with in decades. And during that book club, she told me the story of how my mom revealed her Alzheimer's diagnosis to her. And it's a story I had never heard before. And so we were all like crying during this book club, and I'm getting a little teary even now. But it was really like, at this point in my life, I never expected to hear a story about my mom that I didn't know before. And so that was such a gift. And it's something that wouldn't have happened without, just reaching out to readers in this way. So that was just a really amazing gift that came out of doing the book clubs.
Well, thank you. And so if a book club wanted to have you as a guest speaker, they would contact you directly. Am I correct there? So
if you go on, I will give you the link really quick. Calendly.com. Let me find.
Yeah.
So I have just a profile link. So this will show you kind of what it's like better than. So I have my own URL, and if you click on that, then it will take you to my page, and you can see that I offer virtual book clubs. And then when you click on the virtual book club, you can see what dates and times I'm available.
Could you post that again?
It's in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's the type of thing that you can set up. I know some people have more detailed pages and whatnot, but you know, I basically give people an overview. I say that I will meet with a book club of 5 to 12 readers. And I just established those because that was, you know, of course I'm flexible on that. But first of all, I didn't want a group to book me as a speaker for like 200 people or something, you know? And I also didn't want just like one creepy person booking me for a book club and just staring at me for a half hour. So I wanted to set those limits just so that it is for a genuine group of readers.
Okay, I noticed on your thing that you sent me, and with your book and your book club info, you say, "I'd love to speak to book clubs." I guess the link is also on that, Maggie.
It is, yeah. The URL is at the bottom of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna take this.
So
All right.
if anyone else has any other questions, you can feel free to email me. It's very easy. It's maggiedowns@gmail.com.